what you just said. I think what we'll do with the questions, if this is okay with you, Steve. I mean, let's take absolutely, 2 or 3 and then... Yeah, okay.
Simon, I'm going to go there.
Right, okay. That Russian hat is coming round, and I'm just going to repeat my thing. If you're new to this, stick your hand up, ask a question. Otherwise, I can see people with grey hair.
Sorry.
That's all right. Don't apologise. And I see you guys. Anybody? Okay. Let's have you, please, and then Pritam, and then right.
I wonder what point you would say that the Bolsheviks decided we couldn't really trust popular organs of expressing opinions, and therefore decided to call it a day. Would you say it was as early as the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly?
Pretty much. I mean, I think the Constituent Assembly election represents the peak of popular support for the Bolsheviks, so it's around about 23%, say, and that is very much because the army is still in the field, although most units vote for the SRs, for the Socialist Revolutionaries. Thereafter, I think it becomes a real struggle, and that's in part why they, I think reluctantly, I mean, we talk about the Bolsheviks. I mean, I think through this period there are important distinctions to be made between types of Bolshevik and so on. But essentially, I think the Soviets have become unreliable as organs of rule really from spring 1918. So, you know, they're in a much more antagonistic relationship. And Soviet power actually become, I haven't talked about this, but Soviet power by the end of the Civil War, if we're thinking about what does a Soviet do, say in the countryside, it has a really quite coercive relationship to its constituents and is often quite corrupt.
Okay, and can you all hear, at the back? Okay,
no.
Fine. Not quite. Okay, little.
Shout.
Okay. Shout your questions as well, please.
All right. Thank you. I can see the purpose of your exercise, that you want to puncture the celebratory kind of attitude towards the Bolshevik Revolution, and you pointed out all the weaknesses in terms of facing the working class and the peasantry and so on and so forth. But would it be?
Can you speak up or
could
speak
you
that
could
way?
you could you spend 2 more minutes to also say how could the Bolsheviks stay in power if they did not have some kind of a popular support? What was the nature of the popular support that did not? And of course you've done this in your work and so on and so forth. That will be useful. The second following from this is that you mentioned about the impact of the Bolshevik Revolution in the colonies. It is absolutely true. It touched the imagination of people, you know. And would you think that part of this imagination was also not knowing enough what was actually happening in Russia? That they did not know the brutality and the negativity, and therefore they only looked from the end of exploitation and so on and so forth. There are British colonial reports saying that peasants talking about in the villages, oh, something new has happened in this country, you know, and what a new world is being created. That was really massive.
Shall we take
Let's do that.
Yeah, you made a joke at the beginning, I think fairly reasonably, about Trotskyists and Trotskyist interpretations. And speaking as someone who would still describe themselves as a Trotskyist, albeit of a rather heterodox variety, there was absolutely nothing in your talk that I would challenge or disagree with in terms of the empirical evidence, some of which was already beautifully written about by Victor Serge, you run one of the Russian revolutions. So there's nothing there. There seems to me, though, 2 questions I want to ask, because you describe what happened, and I don't disagree with that, and you describe it in the context of 2 other things. That is, ongoing economic collapse, which had begun during the First World War in Russia, that continues right through the period. And secondly, the question of the Civil War, and the fact that, you know, a white victory would mean the hangman, white terror, and the destruction, not just of Bolsheviks. We take as a good example hundreds of thousands of Jews who were victims of anti-Semitic pogroms in the West. So I've got 2 questions really. One, given the cities weren't producing anything, or what they were producing was essentially for the war effort, for the survival, what alternative did the government have from seizing grain from the peasants, because they didn't have anything to give the peasants. They didn't have the goods the peasants needed because they needed to produce for the war and feed the cities. So I'm wondering what the alternative was. And the second question, that I had was that you talk about a democratic resurgence, a democratic counter-revolution, the regrowth of the Bolsheviks and whatever in 1918.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it was possible to have had a democratic political alternative to the Soviet regime in 1918 and 1919 that wouldn't, I'm finishing, that wouldn't have ended in pogroms and white terror?
Right, just hold it there. Sorry, Brendan suggesting something about improving the amplification.
Maybe we've got to suggest Steve speaks from the mic.
Okay, but before you do, let's just have Marco, and then is that all right? Do you want? Can you take one more question?
Yeah, of course I can.
Yeah, right, okay.
I'm indefatigable.
The relationship between the workers and the peasants, a bit more about that complex. I mean, it's quite easy to understand, like that there were workers' control. There was a history of councils that in towns like St. Petersburg could have some social vision. So there is an equivalent on the peasant side. So, for example, Luxembourg, she criticized Lenin when he said, give the land to the tiller, and said, you're going to create problems in the future. You have got individualized form of production. Was there an alternative from the Bolsheviks? Did they have the time to say, okay, we do it all collectively now? And was there an exchange between the urban experience of workers' control outside of the party and this kind of peasant uprisings? Because, yeah, it's understandable that if the peasant is only confronted with the urban area by an army that comes and takes the grain, why would they share? Only if they had some urban exchange, knowing that we have the responsibility to feed, other parts of society, then this kind of link would have happened. Was it maybe through the army that they were kind of demobilized soldiers and had met workers in the army? I mean, what kind of chance would there have been between workers' control and peasant control, so to speak?
Yeah, should I? Yeah, Brendan's
that
already
might help.
Yes.
keen that I should. I mean, I think let's start with a second question to frame this. I mean, I think that the problem about many Marxist accounts of this period is that they rightly stress the extraordinary constraints that are placed by economic collapse, civil war, but they kind of don't admit that there are choices to be made. And choices can be made even within very, very terrible circumstances. And the reason I start there is because I think in relation to the peasants, there were plenty of people saying, why don't the Bolsheviks use the cooperative movement? Russia had the largest network of cooperatives certainly in the world, and the problem was for the Bolsheviks, they were controlled by socialist revolutionaries, often of a rather right-wing kind, often hostile to the Bolsheviks. And for Lenin, the question was a political one. We don't trust these people. We are not going to work with them. But I think if you look at the local peasant congresses, they're often under left SR control. So they're not conservative in the sense that many right-wing SRs are. But they will say, we can start to encourage artisanal industry. We can start to revive various kinds of domestic crafts and things. This might be a way forward. There were a lot of quite interesting, creative ideas. Whether they would have worked, I think, is kind of very open to question, because I don't, myself, in answer to that second question, I don't believe that there was a kind of democratic sort of outcome that would have been obviously superior to Bolshevik dictatorship. But my point is that the Bolsheviks had ideas that filter their view of the world, that these kept certain possibilities well out of reach. So although the constraints were absolutely fundamental, so I'm not trying to say this was a kind of period when they could have kind of engaged in some of the things that were very important in 1917. So workers' control isn't a factor. I mean, workers' control stops by about February 1918. It gets kind of institutionalized somewhat within the nationalized enterprises, but it is, and to be fair, a kind of collegial management structure is maintained through the Civil War. So that involves representatives from factory committees, trade unions, as well as management. So there is a kind of residual workers' control, but it's a very, very feeble version compared with what workers wanted in 1917. Was that again realistic? I think I'd probably say no, because fundamentally the problem facing Russian industry was incredibly low productivity. And what happens in the 1920s is that you get the sort of restitution of forms of kind of capitalist organisation of the labour process, which is really the only way that they can begin to tackle the fundamental problem of low productivity. And that's partly about labour, but it's also about the backwardness, technically, of Russian industry. So, in terms of exchange, the exchange comes kind of more in the 1920s. There's the emergency situation has died away, and in the 1920s there are efforts for workers to sponsor particular parts of the countryside, to send newspapers, to encourage delegations and so on. But during the Civil War, I would say the relationship is a very brutal, confrontational one. Insofar as peasants meet workers, other than workers who've gone back to the villages because they've no jobs, it is kind of in the form of food detachments by and large. They come, food detachments, or as part of military or quasi-military units, because the Cheka has its own sort of military force. That's kind of where the town kind of meets the countryside, and it's a very, very dismal experience. Going back to your point, I think I want to say that popular support is not irrelevant, but it's very shaky. That's popular support understood in terms of broad classes, so it's very shaky. But I think what the Bolshevik Revolution shows, and I think it's then shown by the Chinese Revolution, is that you can have relatively small numbers of activists, highly motivated, well organised through army and party organisations, who can make revolution. I mean, they become the social base for the revolution. So the Bolsheviks actually create a social base. I'm not trying to rubbish or sort of do down the people who identify with the revolution. I think, there's an extraordinary degree of idealism there. But I think one of the things that has emerged, because you were asking what's new, is the level of kind of sheer corruption and careerism among local party and Soviet activists. In 1921, the party has a purge. The party, I think my numbers are pretty right. The party by that stage has about 750,000 members, and they kick out a whole 1/4 of those for drunkenness, corruption, not doing their political duty, bribery, squeezing the peasants, shooting people they don't like. I mean, it's a very, very brutalized kind of culture. And that, I would say, and sort of coming back to your question again, is an area where there were Bolsheviks who were saying, we've lost any sense of, they use the word humanist, which is humanity. Bolsheviks, we know, don't believe in rights. But I mean, the complete refusal of so many elements of the Bolshevik party to accept that members of enemy classes have certain kinds of rights by dint of being human beings is something that's absolutely not accepted. So, you get a language of extermination. We exterminate the bourgeoisie. And that word is there. It's istreblение in Russian. Lenin uses it. Not that much. Dzerzhinsky, lots. But, this is a kind of rather horrifying foreshadowing of things that Bolsheviks had no sense were to come. But, that sort of idea that whole classes need to be exterminated in order to create a better society is something I think that's now really undeniable. So I can absolutely, as a historian, say I don't think there were any real alternatives. I mean, there were, but I want to say there were certain choices that proved to be fateful. And, you know, none of us can see the unforeseen consequences of the things we do. But I think as historians wanting to sort of learn about this revolution, we do have to bring more of a kind of critical sense than simply to say, well, you know, the circumstances were so overwhelming that they couldn't do anything but what they did. I think there were always voices within the Bolshevik leadership that were saying, no, you know, we need to rein in the Cheka. They kept trying to do it. It's completely useless. And there were members of the Cheka who were, you know, extremely honourable, you know, really did believe that they were dealing with counter-revolution. Counter-revolution was absolutely real. You know, there's counter-revolution everywhere. So I'm not sort of prettifying the kind of circumstances. The circumstances were grim. But I do think we have to kind of recognise that even in the bleakest and most constrained circumstances, actors, especially revolutionary actors, do have certain choices, however limited. I don't know, I mean, the colonies are kind of, I mean, I know about China, you know, so 1919, Karahan, you know, a really interesting character. The Bolshevik Party is full of really interesting characters, and one of the things we now know much more, because most of these people are shot in 1938, so when I was, you know, a postgraduate many years ago, you looked in vain for biographical details about these people, but Karakan, he becomes deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. He's from an Armenian family. He's trained as a lawyer. He becomes quite popular with negotiating with Turkey, which is quite kind of unimaginable in the wake of the genocide. But he has, you know, personal qualities of sort of diplomacy, really, which allow him to engage in, you know, remarkable diplomatic work for the early Soviet state. But he, in 1919, publishes the Karakan Declaration, which says, you know, the new regime absolutely repudiates all Tsarist rights in China. Well, and obviously, they weren't similar rights in India. But I mean, that has enormous impact in China. I mean, you know, the numbers of people who read the press are kind of fairly limited, but it really gets a lot of publicity. This is the first time that a Western state has said, you know, we stand firmly against colonial exploitation, colonial privilege. Whether that was, you know, a kind of... I mean, I want to say that that was actually a correct perception, you know, on the part of anti-colonial Chinese. I mean, I think that's kind of very real. But I mean, there are those who would say, you know, well, by the late 1920s, Russia was claiming rights over China's railways, etc., just in the same way that the British and the French had done around 1900. So, you know, there is a kind of dynamic which is moving in some sort of direction towards Stalinism. But I'm not, by the way, arguing that there was some sort of direct line of continuity to Stalinism at all.
Yeah, okay. Let's go 1, 2, 3. Yeah.
You mentioned the decline of the working class during the Civil War, and so we can argue about its significance. What do you think its impact was on the development of the regime, perhaps on the point of the accountability of those sort of corrupt officials you referenced recently?
And I've forgotten who was number 2. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about some of that sort of stuff that really inspires us now, and anyone sort of like a child of the 60s and onwards, you know, about some of the social liberation, you know, like the great sort of decrees. You know, like, you know, the thing about the Bolsheviks, they wanted to clear away the whole world, they wanted to change everything, they were amazing for that, you know, so...
Speak up a bit.
Get rid of irons, you know, like women, you know, like women that vote. Get rid of marriage, get rid of net curtains, you know, like, you know, it sounds really amazing, but if you go to sort of see, like, the amount of time you have to spend cleaning net curtains and home stuff, if you get rid of that stuff,
You don't have net curtains,
you don't have net curtains. But I also wanted to sort of mention sort of some of the other stuff as well. The Bolsheviks, you know, they changed time, they changed the calendars, you know, they you know, as well as the nationalisation, you know, the idea of universal peace. You know, obviously they got rid of statues and insignias, you know, the palaces were ransacked, so everything sort of was up for grabs. But on the other side of it, I think is, you know, there's some positives and negatives when you look at sort of some of that sort of stuff. But, you know, things around sort of children, I think that's really amazing. You know, no learning by rote. Imagine that in Britain today, no learning by rote. Experiential learning, no homework for children. You know, some of that sort of amazing stuff. Also, you know, some of the problems with children, do we punish children? No, they set up, you know, in places like Moscow, psychoanalytic clinics. Once Stalin's son actually went to it, you know, so it's interesting that Stalin got rid of them in the late sort of 20s, but his own son went to that. And there was no punishment. You know, you've got to fight the causes of pain. Action should be explained with children, and if you've got these like sort of naughty unconscious instincts, turn them into creativity. So the bit that you made about the Bolsheviks didn't change the world and it's been deferred, but the social ideas behind that, what the people did on the ground, was some amazing stuff, and I think we should still be inspired by that today.
And
I just wanted to pick you up on what you describe as the brutalisation and the inevitable militarisation of the revolution. I want to ask you if you think that was built into the Bolshevik project to begin with, or did it simply evolve? And I want to, just second and final point, there's a slight danger in the way you did the presentation. I completely understand the temptation to do this, but the Civil War is a catastrophe for everybody, including the Bolsheviks. It's not what they wanted. In Red Petrograd, I think your first major work, what's so exciting about that book, and the way it's almost lost in your talk tonight, is this is the most advanced and exciting dynamic, not just a workers' control, but a workers' government of ordinary people running production. Now, it didn't last very long. It lasted just a few months, but it lasted long enough for a different kind of running production, ordinary people running production, not for profit but for use. It existed, we saw it, if only for a few months. There's a danger that we lose sight of that in the talk you've given, despite that it's in your own work.
Yeah. I mean, one could turn that round and say, well, why did it only last 2 months? I mean, the point is the Bolsheviks themselves brought it to an end.
The Civil War and Brest-Litovsk peace treaty cut out any possibility?
Well, yes, but we're back to this idea of kind of extreme determinism. This is the problem of your kind of approach. I mean, that everything happens because there was no alternative. And I want to say, well, the options for alternatives were very, very limited. But I mean, had the Bolsheviks had a serious commitment to workers' control, and I don't think they did, then there would have been a more sustained attempt to try and preserve some embryonic form of this. Now, you know, a whole series of things. You can think about democratic armies, which was, you know, the abolition of a standing army, the creation of a workers' militia. You can take, as I say, Soviets as the institutions through which people would rule. Now, I would absolutely concede that the reasons why these things don't get very far is primarily because of civil war or economic collapse or general adverse circumstances. But I mean, there were debates and arguments within the Bolshevik leadership about these things. There didn't have to be a complete close down of factory committees. In January 1918, the trade unions win that particular battle, and factory committees become the sort of organs of the trade unions in the workplace. But that really does mark the end of that kind of workers' control. I think if you look at somebody like Lenin, in fact, his attitudes are fluctuating. I don't think that, you know, he's kind of determined to institute one-person management at that point. But I mean, very, very quickly, he becomes convinced, and I think he's probably right, that, you know, the Russian worker needs to learn to work. I mean, that's a very kind of reactionary sort of position, but I think it actually makes sense in the context that the Bolsheviks find themselves. So, you know, my argument would be that ideas, active sort of choices, have to be factored into this kind of account. I mean, the other contribution, I've just written this book which is about the Russian Revolution, but it actually starts around about 1890. So there's, I want to say, 1905, the First World War are important, but significantly it ends in 1928, which I see as a point of real discontinuity. But there are 7 chapters, And so there are two on late Tsarist Russia, there's one on 1917, there are two on the Civil War, and there are two on NEP. And the last chapter is very much in the spirit that we were talking about. I mean, I think if you look at education, if you look at town planning, if you look at housing, if you look at the arts, if you look at sculpture, if you look at, yes, psychology kinds of efforts to rethink lots of sorts of issues, then you see what I would see as the kind of emancipatory impulses of revolution working themselves out. Many of them are actually losing energy before violent collectivization and the first 5-year plan, which I would see as a kind of Stalinist revolution from above, which marks discontinuity. I mean, I also see more elements of continuity than you would, but nevertheless, I think it's a real change in the character of the revolution. But, you know, it's not the case that it's a bolt out of the blue, which one can see no sorts of foreshadowings. And somebody like Serge, who was mentioned before, certainly would kind of accept that. I mean, Serge is not sort of arguing that, you know, there weren't these kinds of darker sides of Bolshevism in the period when Lenin was still alive. But I mean, my point is not to it's not to try and do down the positive elements of this. And, you know, I want to argue that the Bolshevik Revolution, I certainly don't think it's a model for 20th century socialists, but I do think that the challenge that it posed has still not been accommodated. I think the challenge to, you know, the dynamic of accumulation and inequality of capitalism remains devastating today. And just as you could say the English Revolution saw off the divine right of kings, or the French Revolution saw off you know, the idea of nobility through birth, I think there are still things in that Russian Revolution, the challenge to complete sort of acceptance of inequality as a fact of life, that may well, you know, they may well take on new importance in the context of the 20th century. But I'm absolutely convinced that, you know, Bolshevism 1921 style is not something that we should be seeking to reproduce in our own time.
Okay, yeah.
Paul, and then, yeah.
A couple of related sort of questions. One is that were not the Bolsheviks part of the Second International, saw themselves as social democrats till the revolution, and that whole tradition of the Second International was very statist, very top-down, didn't really look at how power was going to be exercised by the working class through its parties. The question of party and class was not really discussed, and Lenin's State and Revolution sort of cuts off at the point, when you look at the plan he had for it, at that very point, as if he couldn't actually work it out. And so you've always had that problem of party and class. How do the two relate? And what happens when the class starts moving away from the party, which has got power? And that's always a problem when it's not just a question of a parliamentary democracy, where it's just this party or that party in the same system, but you've actually got, if the Bolsheviks left the forced out, who and what would happen afterwards, which is, I think, part of the problem they faced and why they actually ruled increasingly coercively, was because of the concern of what is going to happen if we go. Because after all, not many parties supported council rule, Soviet rule. It was only the left SRs did. The rest didn't. Also with the Bolsheviks, were they not, the part of the whole thing of seizing powers, it was not just a Russian thing. This was the opening blow of a world revolution, hence the Comintern was set up in 1919. So you hold on to power at all costs, with the unfortunate things we've discussed tonight, the shortcuts, coercion and so forth, and corrupting, sort of the corruption that does to those in power.
until you have a world revolution. You know, unless there's a revolution in Europe, we will perish, said Lenin. So that's also, I think, playing on their minds. But also, perhaps look at it slightly differently. The fact that you had parties vying for power after 1970, after that period, rather than broader social movements, I've always felt that is a sign of weakness in Russia, that the class, the working class, couldn't control its parties, not just the Bolsheviks, but other parties. And how could the peasantry work, govern as the majority of the country, of the population? How would they manage vis-a-vis parties and so forth to rule, if the peasantry can rule at all?
Okay. Yeah.
You compared the Russian peasantry to the German peasantry. Just wondering why they had a level of organisation and consciousness that was seemed to be unique across the rest of Europe. You mentioned Lenin saying that Russian workers must learn to work, and I think I won't make a long point, but in the State and Revolution, it's already mentioned, which is obviously writing it before October. He actually makes a point, at one point he says, any escape by workers from what was popular accounting and control will be accompanied by such swift and severe punishment by armed workers that the door will be thrown wide open for the complete withering of the state. In other words, in the back of Lenin's mind, maybe in the forefront, is that the very act of workers imposing armed discipline on themselves through the guards, through the factory workers, through the checker perhaps, is going to create a stateless society, communism. And my understanding of Marx and Marxism is that is the exact opposite of any genuine Marxist or anarchist or genuine socialist ideas. I'm not suggesting for a moment that Lenin didn't have other ideas in his head, but I think it's the very nature of the Russian situation, the poverty, the backwardness, for want of a better word, and the war. I mean, we're talking about the worst war in human history is happening in this period. Under those circumstances, perhaps it's understandable that the Bolsheviks would have had this logic, because it's all they could do. But it has, as you make the point, I don't think it has anything to do with what we need to learn now about how a future revolution might take place. So in a sense,
there's lots there, I mean, all three. I think, the problem in thinking about party and class is the assumption that there is a single party that represents the interests of the working class. And I think that the Bolsheviks had different views on that, certainly in 1917. So, Soviet power as a slogan in the autumn of 1917 isn't understood as Bolshevik rule. It's understood as some kind of multi-party democracy based on factories, mainly, or sometimes other groups that were sort of brought in. That proved completely unworkable. And I think Lenin is correct when he says, correct, this is a judgment, but I think he's probably right in thinking that a coalition is not going to work when we have sort of SRs who are fighting us in Moscow, when we have SRs who, strong supporters of the war and so on. I think from there, Lenin, and this is, me inferring things, but I think Lenin sort of quite quickly kind of moves to a position that actually you need a single party in control. Otherwise, the revolution is going to be endangered or defeated or whatever. I think for lots of workers, the idea of Mensheviks, left SRs, who were in their ranks. They're there in the factories. They're not many, but they're dozens. They're not sort of, isolated individuals. These were people who they saw as leaders in the way they'd seen Bolsheviks as leaders in 1917. And they continue to see Bolsheviks in their ranks as leaders too. There wasn't this kind of exclusive idea that, there's a single party that represents the interests of the working class. in relation to the war, I think that's slightly different. I mean, the Bolsheviks stand for the revolution in a way that other parties don't. I mean, even that's complicated because I think we assumed that the Bolsheviks had kind of very early decided that the SRs and the Mensheviks were counter-revolutionaries into the dustbin of history. In fact, right through the Civil War, there are kinds of negotiations going on, especially not at the top level, but in regions. So in Ukraine, you know, left SRs are encouraged to do their kind of terrorist stuff behind the Ukrainian lines in all kinds of Soviets through to the summer of 1980. So beyond the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, which ends the alliance in government, things continue. And, you know, twice the Mensheviks are legalized, the SRs are... So it's not clear to me that the Bolsheviks had kind of completely written off these people, and that, I think, is in part because they recognized the strength of support. And I think Menshevik support kind of arguable, but I think in a wider popular political culture, there was very strong support for the kinds of rather fuzzy principles of the SRs, the kind of populism. I believe that, you know, the land and the means of production belong to those who work them, the idea that the real nation are the people. These were kinds of ideas that were very, very deep, especially among peasants, but you can find them among workers too, and I think, you know, we lose sight of that. I mean, there's that kind of elements of syndicalism there as well, so I mean, although I don't personally think the factory committee movement was syndicalist, I think it had, you know, a rather more sophisticated kind of sense of how you might run industry. Nevertheless, there were syndicalist elements within it, which were very, very much about, you know, the empowerment of those on the shop floor with ownership and control over their means of production. So some of that is just saying there's a context in which we have to try and understand why there was support for other parties apart from the Bolsheviks. And I think that despite the rhetoric, which is extremely negative, the actual actions of the Bolsheviks it's the moderate Bolsheviks, people like Kamenev, who are sent off to talk to, you know, the SR Central Committee. The SRs, of course, once they're crushed by the whites, turn against the whites, so potentially they're on the side of the revolution again. So, but there are complicated kinds of things going on, which I think rather belie the idea that these are simply sort of petty bourgeois parties that have sold out to the counter-revolution. But, you know, in 1917, Soviets were multi-party bodies, and that's kind of part of the understanding of what Soviet power meant. On the peasantry, I think, you know, one of the reasons I want to kind of take the story back is because I think in 1917, many, many millions of peasants had grandparents who'd been serfs. They remembered the sell-out deal that had been done in 1861. There was a feeling that you know, the gentry had benefited from so-called emancipation of the serfs. This kind of bit very deep. There was determination on the peasants' part to get access to land they considered to be theirs. And they had this very deep sense that the land belongs to those who work it, who make it productive, who make it fruitful. You know, landowners don't do that. So, but in terms of sort of organisation, I think it's a bit more problematic. There were the commune, the sort of peasant. The commune wasn't sort of everywhere in Russia, but the commune understood as this strange organ that periodically redistributed land to reduce risk within the village, to ensure that the poorest peasants were not a burden on the wealthier families. This was, I think, a source of kind of collectivism, and you know, the populists back in the 1860s and 70s had said this could be the basis for socialism. So there were ways in which peasant values were articulated and institutionalized that I think made for a much, much more collective kind of peasantry than you would find in Germany. Now, as against that, and I think it's true of all peasant societies, there is this kind of typical tension between impulses towards collectivization and individualism. And there's no question that, you know, peasants could be highly individualistic too. And, you know, peasants could do what the Bolsheviks accused them of doing, which is, you know, hiding grain, preventing it from getting to the people who needed it. So, you know, I don't sort of romanticize the peasants, but I think there was a sort of collective culture among the Russian peasantry that is quite unusual, and made them more susceptible to socialism. And peasants believe in socialism. I mean, it's socialism according to their lights, but they took of socialism. They, you know, they identify enemies of socialism in their midst. They talk the language of kulaks, for example. It's not just some Bolshevik invention. You know, they see wealthy, selfish kinds of families within their village being a kind of threat to the sort of more equal and more commonly shared sort of life that they aspire to. There are lots of things I could say about peasants. I mean, there are really important generational differences. There's change taking place in the Russian countryside, which is accelerated by the Civil War. But the paradoxical immediate effect of the Civil War is actually to strengthen the commune, to strengthen traditionalism within the village, rather than to generate kind of new, more individualistic impulses. But that is also part of the story. I mean, I you know, when I engaging in the sort of self-criticism, and I think, you know, there are all kinds of reasons that people might kind of see for this, but when I read Petrograd, I did actually think that it might be possible to create, to find a way out of the constraints of backwardness through a more democratic kind of structure. And I was very, I wasn't very hostile to Lenin. I've always tried to kind of treat Lenin with respect and try and kind of see things through his eyes. And, you know, in general, I think he's extraordinarily perspicacious and deeply realistic. And I think he was realistic in thinking that, you know, factory committees were not managing to preserve levels of discipline. Absenteeism was going kind of sky high. People were having to kind of survive by, you know, taking things from the factories, trying to kind of make cigarette lighters out of them, and so on and so forth. I mean, this was kind of, you know, a situation in which, you know, basically survival was the issue. So all kinds of things were going wrong, which, you know, Lenin, in his rather kind of typical way, said, right, you know, we take decisive action. And I don't always take the rhetoric of Lenin seriously. I think that's a mistake, but, you know, it's not untypical of Lenin to say, right, you know, hang the kind of worst offenders. I don't think the worst offenders did get hung, at least in this particular context. But, you know, that's the kind of thing that makes people sort of edgy. But I think we've got to kind of understand it as a sort of, you know, a rhetorical device that is central to his kind of political thinking. I can't remember if there were any other questions that I've wandered around.
Can you answer to the extent and influence of the decline of the working class in the Civil War?
Yeah, sorry, I forgot.
No,
Yes.
that's fine.
I mean, yes, you know, the working class is much, much reduced in size. That has, so many of the activists of 1917 go off to fight in the Red Army. They become sort of lower party officials. They try to maintain the sort of rudimentary structure, try to create rudimentary structures of Soviets. Some of them join the Cheka. So you get the most active, the most militant element that had been supporting the Bolsheviks within the working class gets taken out. And that's part of the reason why you can have sort of Menshevik activists or leftists are activists who kind of take their place because they continue to work. In Petrograd, the reduction, the shrinkage of the working class is very significant. In Moscow, it's also significant, but less so. But if you look at some of the sort of areas in the provinces, the working class, particularly sort of areas like the Urals or the Don Basin in now Ukraine. These are areas where there is a working class, and much of the kind of organisation from 1917 remains. So it's not quite true to say the Bolsheviks were left without a working class. And what I was trying to say is that that working class, when pushed into a corner, supported the Bolsheviks, but the relationship is very, very conflictual, and I think we have a better understanding of that. And it's a complicated question nevertheless, because it's how essentially economic grievances around supplies, rationing, attempts to increase labour discipline, how these very, very quickly get expressed in political form, so as critiques of the Bolsheviks. And so one could read all that evidence, and some historians do, as a working class that's completely alienated from the regime, that, you know, there's a kind of direct confrontation. I don't read it like that, because I think the dynamics are kind of quite complicated. Nobody's mentioned Kronstadt, thankfully, but I mean, I think actually, and Sally knows more than I do, but I think, you know, in spring 1918 in Petrograd, when you've got very, very widespread strikes, the implications, political implications, are not taken as far as they are by the Kronstadt rebels. So they're not calling for...
Did you mean spring 1921?
Sorry, spring 1921. Sorry, they're not calling for Soviets without Bolsheviks, for example. But, you know, nevertheless, it's a powerful challenge. And again, that's evidence that can always be read as the Bolsheviks had no choice. You know, they were faced with sort of very angry, fierce opposition from their former supporters. They were isolated. What could they do but, you know, resort to repression? Well, apart from the fact that they resort to carrots as well as to sticks. And repression against the working class is not as fierce by any means as it is against peasants. But nevertheless, you know, their ideas come into this, and their ideas are that there are always, you know, treacherous, hostile elements, flagged as Mensheviks, say, or SRs, who are deliberately stirring up workers in order to create a political crisis. And I'm kind of sceptical of that. I mean, I think there are plenty of reasons why workers felt aggrieved. An idea like the commissarocracy doesn't come from nowhere. That comes from political activists. It comes from left-wing opponents of the Bolsheviks. So yes, certainly activists play a part. They help to give a language. They help to give shape organisationally to protest. But I'm struck by, in the last analysis, the ease with which the Bolsheviks usually could diffuse that. So I think the working class kind of was more or less sort of on side, and that is a factor in the Civil War. But, you know, in the larger story, I'm kind of saying, and I think this is true of communist revolutions in the 20th century, it's armies and party organisation and propaganda that make for social revolutions. And although there are usually inputs of more spontaneous activity on the part of the masses, frequently, and less so in Russia than say in China, but frequently what that relationship is about is actually external organisation trying to kind of channel, manipulate, sometimes suppress, in order to give a kind of energy to this larger project. And I think actually that's there in the Civil War. And if you know, Lenin says, oh, you know, the proletariat in Baku has just taken power. Please, you know, the Red Army has gone into Azerbaijan, and there were no Soviets there. And it's kind of set up military revolutionary committees, which are, you know, activists. But, you know, that is a kind of easy language that sort of allows the reality to be marked. The reality is, I want to argue that armies and parties are the decisive agents, and the masses are not irrelevant, but they're essentially secondary to that scenario.
Now, I think this is going great. I feel we're kind of moving towards the end. I would feel really happy if not to do this artificially, but I would like to hear some women's voices asking a question or making a point. So while you all think of a point to make or a question to ask, let me just tell you about the next of these talks, which will be on Thursday the 24th of November, by Brendan McGeever, who's up the back there, who works here at Birkbeck. Essentially, I'm going to tell you my understanding of what his research is about. Shout at me if this is wrong. The Bolshevik policy on anti-Semitism could be, I always saw it as, one of the first anti-racist policies in the world. Brendan's research essentially is, how did it work on the ground? We know what was written in the slogans, that zero tolerance, this is not to happen, and so on and so on. What actually happens when the Red Army goes into a village? What actually happens in the interaction between the commissarocracy or whoever, the peasants and so on? So that's the research he's done. He'll be speaking about that. So that's Thursday the 24th of November, and as I said before, please register on Eventbrite, have a look at the Social Histories 1917 pages that we have up there, but register, because if you hadn't registered for this talk, we wouldn't have such a big room, because we wouldn't have known you were all going to come. Okay. Yeah. And then Sasha, yeah, okay. Yeah.
This isn't a woman's question.
No.
But you mentioned the rejection of the belief in human rights among the Bolsheviks, and how the language of extermination and extremism, was very much behind the repressive tendencies at the time. And of course, this lack of human rights very much a part of the Soviet Union in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and so on. They kept saying only social and economic rights, not political rights. And again, with Putin now, we have a return to this idea that there is no such thing as human rights, liberal human rights don't exist, and so on. Now, a lot of this does come from Marxism, but I wondered if you could explain where the Russian tradition for this kind of lack of belief in human rights, which is called humanist, comes from in the Russian tradition.
Sasha, yeah?
I just wanted to say that I think we should give some emphasis on the rhetoric of Lenin himself, and the phrases like bloody terror, кровавый террор, and that everything would be very good in the Soviet Union, which is dictatorship of proletariat, dictatura proletariat plus electrification of the whole country. So he did give emphasis to the working class, and that was a psychological, if you want, flirting with them so that they will support the revolution. And the second one, the rhetoric of instilling huge fear in the whole population, and mostly obviously in peasants, was there with all the rhetoric of killing, you said it, hanging, whatever. It was a normal thing for him to say that shoot, hang, and the rest of it. So, and bloody terror, кровавый террор. Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Just continuing with very cluster questions. I wanted to ask you if you could go back to the nationalities question a little bit, partly because you didn't spend that much time on it, partly because I think you, if I understood you correctly, mentioned Korenizatsiya as part of as one of these potentially positive developments that came out of the revolution, and while I hesitate to argue with that, it seems like it seems like some of the positive outcomes were in spite of the policy rather than because of the policy. So if you could say a bit more about how you see Korenizatsiya.
Yeah. I mean, this is where I kind of move closer to some of the sort of earlier contributors. I mean, I think if you're thinking about terror, so kravavý terror,
it's bloody terror, right?
Bloody terror, yeah. This is kind of totally a phrase that Lenin uses. But I think civil wars are like that. I mean, I think civil wars are fundamentally about there's a collapse of state power, and obviously a collapse of law, but there is endemic insecurity. Nobody knows what the outcome will be. And terror, rightly or wrongly, and I guess in my view wrongly, becomes a kind of way of sending signals. It is precisely designed to try and undermine the morale of the enemy. I think that the Bolsheviks had quite, or there was a strong element within the Bolshevik party that was extremely unhappy with terror, that was pressing for the Cheka to be subject to law. Lenin tended to resist that, but Lenin's own views kind of are not easy to characterize. They tend to waver. So we know, especially towards the end of the Civil War, he took an interest in individuals who'd been taken hostage. But on the other hand, Lenin also uses this terrible word about istreblение. Talks, Kazan is
extermination.
Yeah, sorry, Kazan is taken by the Czech Legion in, I think, about May or June 1918. He says, exterminate them. Kind of exterminate the whole lot of them. It's a very, very inflated rhetoric, and that kind of leads back to the question about human rights. And in my, I'm sure there are many people in the room like me who are very sceptical about the way that human rights talk is used in a very manipulative and very double-handed and very, very cynical way in our times. We're concerned about human rights in Syria, not so concerned about Saudi violations of human rights in Yemen. There are all these kinds of contradictions, but I do think that the kind of entrenchment of human rights, and there's great argument among historians about when exactly that was, but certainly the Second World War is a kind of important point, but really the discourse of human rights only takes off relatively recently. Looking back in history, you can find progenitors, talk about things we would now characterise as human rights, certainly going back to the French Revolution. And actually you find it in Russia in 1905. Father Gapon leads this sort of religious procession to the centre of St. Petersburg, and it's fired upon by soldiers, hundreds of people killed. But one of the demands, it's a very strange mixture of traditional and modern demands, but one of the kinds of demands is for human rights. That's almost disappeared. It's expunged from revolutionary discourse by 1917. So even the provisional government doesn't use the term human rights. They talk about civil rights and political rights. And the provisional government instituted those. There's no question. You're right. Marxism isn't happy with rights talk. There was a kind of, a deep, assumption that we are primarily defined by our class, not by any sort of individuality. And I think that was an element that served to corrode the political culture of the Bolshevik Party, but there were people who were protesting about that. I don't think Lenin was sympathetic to that kind of protest, though I think, he becomes much, much more sober in his reflections about revolution in the short period before his death. And I think much of the kind of fierce class rhetoric has kind of disappeared in the very, very last 18 months of his life. But I think, it would be a bit false to, it would be a bit ahistorical to sort of judge what the Bolsheviks did by a contemporary standard of human rights. What seems to be important to do is to say that one of the problems about this revolution was that it didn't encompass that way of thinking. And that, is one of the kind of pre-echoes of Stalinism. As I say, I don't think Leninism leads, in some direct line to Stalinism, but there are sort of things in the Civil War period that kind of, do foreshadow things. Nobody had any, the kind of, so enlarging it slightly and taking two questions. I don't actually think the terror of the Civil War is the same as the Stalinist terror. I think they're very different. But on the other hand, much of the kind of rhetoric of exterminating class enemies that we associate with 1937 and 1938, so the height of the Stalinist terror, is already there. It's not necessarily as widely disseminated. It may be more associated with particular groups like the Cheka or certain sort of Bolshevik hardliners, but it is, you can find it. But I think the danger is, people always want to draw a straight line from that into the 30s, and that's very much what's happened in recent times. So there's an obsession with violence, and very few scholars now would see a kind of break between 1920s and Stalin. I'm not of the view that said, Trotsky famously said there's a river of blood between 1920s and 1930s. I don't think that's true. I don't think it's that big a discontinuity, but it is a new revolution. It's a new stage of revolution that really does change the whole political culture. The relationship of the peasant to the peasantry is, massively kind of worse than it is in the Civil War, and I've tried to kind of stress just how horrible that relationship was, but it was nothing like, exterminating kulaks, forcing people at bayonet point into collective farms and so on. So something bad happens to this revolution around the end of the 20s, but it's not, I think, the case that there's no flagging of that possibility prior to, say, 1928, or some people would say 1925, or whatever. On the nationalities question, trying to be very brief, again, you're right. Look, if you look at Ukrainian historiography now, and it's become very nationalistic, but the fact is that it's the Bolsheviks who institute education in Ukrainian, who encourage Ukrainian intellectuals to develop the culture, who have real success in creating a Ukrainian-speaking party intelligentsia. Now, these processes are always ultimately controlled by the Communist Party. So, the limits are kind of set in ways that wouldn't allow this to threaten the position of Moscow. But, huge space is opened in the 1920s, and I think, as I say, that it's highly ahistorical to imagine that in 1920 there was a possibility of a completely independent Ukrainian state. And yes, the Bolsheviks weren't going to tolerate it for all kinds of reasons, but, I think for the Ukrainian people, by and large, what they got was certainly not perfect, but it was better than was on offer. Brendan might be talking about, people like Pityura in his talk, but, these were really kind of desperate and people who didn't have any kind of principled commitment to the sort of internationalism the Bolsheviks did. So, I think, even in the 1920s it varies. The Bolsheviks are bombing Chechnya in 1925. So, but elsewhere. Sorry, no, I finished really. It's a kind of, it's a mixed. It's not even a mixed picture. In the 1920s, the picture is basically positive in my view, but where you have what are called the Basmachi, the kind of guerrilla bandits in Central Asia, or where you have Chechnya, which has never ever accepted Russian rule, then you get the same resort to violence. So although the 1920s is different from the Civil War in that terror recedes really to the margins, it isn't the case that everything becomes suddenly hunky-dory. So, the Cheka isn't eliminated. It's told to, turn its attention to the domestic population. So this is the period when surveillance by the Cheka really takes off. But they're not engaging in the kind of violence against the mass of the population that had been at times carried out during the Civil War. And there are then these kinds of exceptional cases. And people who are hostile, can always seize on these things and tend to kind of magnify them out of the significance they have. The poor Chechens are kind of in favour of sort of an autonomous Chechnya, but, that wasn't on the cards. So, they were just bandits who needed to be kind of subjugated.
I'm sitting here completely undecided. We could take a couple more quick questions, or shall we go to the Institute of Education bar and carry on there? I think, right, okay. Okay, so, thank you very much. Can we thank Steve in the direction there? Thanks for all of you who participated. We will be in the Institute of Education bar. There's the Russian hat, if anybody wants to donate and hasn't done. Any quick announcements of anything? No? Right, okay. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Right.
Oh, never mind that. It's very warm. And I know from my place in the
Okay, there are books on the way out. If you want to buy books from Haymarket Press, or there's another stall up there, various literature, please have a look at it.
Simple directions to the bar?
Simple directions to the bar, I don't know. Follow the crowd. Follow him.
And, oh, you are still at HM? Yes, yes.
Great. Good idea. Well, let's meet up somewhere or somehow.
Can we come and pick your brains sometime about getting around Moscow?